The first thing I noticed was that Specialist Reeves was eating. This is not, on its face, unusual. Biological entities consume nutrients. I am aware of this. I have observed feeding behavior in 47 cataloged species across my 12 cycles of field monitoring. I understand the concept. What I did not understand, what I have still not entirely resolved, even now, writing this from a quarantine bay that smells of disinfectant and something I can only describe as singed copper, was how she was eating. The way she was eating. What she was eating. The corridor outside Bay 14 on the Ossiber Station medical tier was sealed. I want to be precise about this, sealed is not a strong enough word. The hegemony quarantine protocols for a Class 4 biological event require 7 independent atmospheric barriers, a full personnel decontamination lock, continuous negative pressure cycling, and a standing order that no organic material crosses the threshold in either direction without explicit authorization from a medical officer of rank 3 or above. I had helped draft those protocols. I had submitted the revised version myself, following the Vorn colony incident. Reeves had pushed her helmet to the top of her head and was eating something out of a flat metal container. The smell came through the comb channel when she opened her mouth, something fermented, sharp, faintly sulfurous. She ate it with the specific expression of someone consuming a thing they find comforting rather than good. Specialist, I said. She looked up. She had the kind of face that seems perpetually mid-thought, not empty, just occupied elsewhere. You are outside the atmospheric barrier. She looked at the barrier. Looked at her container. Looked back at me through the monitoring glass. Technically I'm beside it, she said, and kept eating. I wrote this in my log under anomalous behavioral prioritization and moved to the next item on my checklist. I had 42 more items. I did not get through all of them that shift. I never did, those first days, because every item on the checklist led to a note, and every note led to a question I didn't have a framework to answer. The Pale Advance had reached Ossiber Station 11 days before the human team's arrival. I keep returning to those 11 days. They matter in the way that the period before a structural failure always matters in retrospect. You can look back at every stress point and see exactly where the cracks were forming, even when nothing appeared wrong from the outside. Ossiber was a relay and research station, mid-tier, population 412 at the time of first contamination detection. By the time the human rapid response team docked in Bay 7, the population was 231, and of those, 62 were in the medical tier in varying states of systemic failure. The pathogen, the hegemony hadn't officially named it yet, the committee was apparently still deliberating, which told you everything about how well the hegemony was handling this attack. The cellular communication systems of every species we tested. It didn't kill like a conventional infection kills. There was no inflammation, no fever, no physical degradation in the early stages. What it did was quieter than that. It disrupted the chemical signaling between cells, selectively and progressively, until organs began operating in isolation from one another. Lungs that no longer received the signal to contract at the correct rate. Cardiovascular systems running on their own uncorrected rhythms. Neurological tissue slowly losing its coordination with the body it was supposed to govern. It looked, in the final stages, like a system that had simply forgotten how to be a whole thing. Our best medical teams had been working on it for 9 days before anyone thought to contact the humans. I say thought, what I mean is admitted we needed to. The distinction matters. There is a particular bureaucratic paralysis that sets in when an organization realizes it is out of ideas but has not yet been authorized to admit that it is out of ideas. We were deep in that paralysis when Commander Velashari, no relation, though I was asked 3 times, finally, transmitted the emergency research request to the Terran Cooperative Rapid Response Division. The humans arrived 41 hours later. 41 hours. The fastest the hegemony could mobilize a comparable team was 230 hours, and that was for non-quarantine situations. I noted this in my log. Then, I noted that I had noted it and tried to determine whether the noting was relevant or whether I was already developing the habit of paying disproportionate attention to human logistics. I decided it was relevant. I also decided I should be more careful about what I decided. The human team was 6 people. Reeves I've already introduced, though that's a generous word for what was essentially me watching her eat contaminated station air through an unsealed helmet. She was the unit's field medic. The others, Corporal Adeyemi, who was the team lead and who I initially misidentified as a senior officer because she gave orders in the specific register of someone who has never once considered whether their orders will be followed, two researchers named Nowak and a Hejurika who communicated primarily in shorthand and appeared to share a single ongoing argument that had been running for so long it had evolved its own vocabulary, a technical specialist named Ferreira, who said very little, but touched everything, running her fingers over equipment and surfaces with an attention that my cultural briefing files described as tactile assessment and which looked, from where I was standing, more like a greeting, and a support operative whose name I didn't catch in the first 2 days because he was always either in a duct or emerging from a duct covered in a substance I chose not to identify. They moved through Ossiver like they'd been briefed on a different building. Not wrong, exactly. Just confident in a way that didn't match the information they had available. The station was at reduced lighting, half its atmospheric systems running in redundancy mode, 3 entire sections sealed for decontamination. The corridors smelled of the antiseptic compounds we'd been flooding the ventilation with, a smell I had come to associate with failure, with the particular texture of things getting worse despite effort. The humans walked into this and, Adeyemi said, to no one in particular, smells like a hospital. Smells like 3 hospitals, Reeves corrected. Is that good? Ihejurika asked. Better than 0 hospitals. I was accompanying them. I had been assigned as their hegemony liaison ostensibly to provide station access and context, actually to monitor and report. Commander Veloshari had been quite clear about this, in the way that superiors are clear about things they would prefer to not be documented. I had documented it anyway. 47 logs. I document everything. It's what I do when I don't know what else to do, and, for the first several days on Ossiver, I did not know what else to do almost constantly. Observer Velastari, Adeyemi said she'd been reading my designation off the station manifest. She told me this later, because she found alien naming conventions interesting rather than difficult, which was somehow more disarming than if she'd simply struggled with my name. What's the current distribution of symptomatic personnel? I told her. She listened the way she did everything else, fully, without the polite performance of attention that most diplomatic contacts offered. She was actually tracking what I said. I could tell because when I reached the part about the neurological staging, she interrupted me with a technical question that indicated she had already read our preliminary pathology reports and was now looking for the information those reports hadn't included. There's a gap in your timeline between day 3 and day 7, she said. Your case count doubles but your report density drops. What happened in that window? I hesitated. 3 of our senior researchers had died in that window. The medical team lead had entered early-stage systemic failure. The data collection had been managed by junior staff who were working, several of them, in the first genuine medical catastrophe of their careers. We had some staffing complications, I said. Adeyemi looked at me. She had the kind of eyes that don't soften a situation without you noticing. Okay, she said. Just that. Then, she turned back to the corridor. Nowak. Pull the day 3 to 7 raw sensor feeds. Don't wait for the formatted reports. Nowak didn't look up from her device. Already requested. I added this to my log and, then, stared at what I'd written for a moment before moving to the next observation. The first real test of my record-keeping came on day 2 of the human team's deployment. Reeves had been working in Bay 14 for 11 hours straight when the station's contamination alarm triggered in Section C7. Not a new contamination, a breach in one of the quarantine seals we'd been maintaining around the secondary pathogen sample storage. A small breach. Technically within recoverable parameters. The protocol was to seal the affected corridor, confirm no personnel exposure, and dispatch a decontamination team in full barrier suits within 6 hours. I was running through this protocol in my head when I realized Reeves was no longer in Bay 14. I found her in Section C7 4 minutes later. She was inside the affected corridor. She had her helmet on. I want to note this, because it took me a moment to register it as relevant, but she was not wearing the additional protective layers required by the exposure protocol. She had a toolkit open on the floor and was repairing the seal with the methodical speed of someone who has done this before, not in theory, not in training, but actually done it, in an actual compromised environment, with actual consequences for failure. Specialist Reeves. She didn't look up. Seal's got a stress fracture. Someone patched it about a week ago, not great work, no offense, and the patch failed. Give me 4 minutes. You are not wearing required barrier equipment. I'm wearing my helmet. The protocol requires, how long would it take to suit up and come back? I processed the question. Approximately 40 minutes. Including decontamination cycling. And, how long for this section of corridor to reach full ambient contamination if the seal isn't closed? I processed this too. Approximately, I stopped. 16 minutes, she said. I asked your station AI before I came in here. Hi, by the way, I don't think we've properly met. Reeves. I do the medic stuff and, also apparently the plumbing. The seal repair took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I counted because I didn't know what else to do with my attention while she was working, and counting felt like a form of control, even if it wasn't. She came out of the corridor, stripped her gloves at the decontamination line, and sprayed her hands with the antiseptic compound we'd been distributing. Then, she wrote something in a small physical notebook she kept in her left breast pocket. What are you writing? I asked. Seal's going to need a full replacement within 48 hours, she said. Writing it down so I remember to put it in the report. She paused. Do you have an engineering crew? Or just the one guy who did the original patch? The one guy who did the original patch was in the medical tier. Early stage systemic failure. I'll make inquiries, I said. Reeves nodded. She didn't push. She just accepted that the information would or wouldn't come, and, in the meantime, she wrote it in her notebook and moved back toward Bay 14. Her boots left small marks on the corridor floor where she'd been crouching, scuffs in the non-slip surface coating. 3 of them. Or 4. I noticed the 4th was deeper than the others, angled like she'd pushed off hard when she stood. I wrote this in my log too. I'm not entirely sure why. On day 3, Nowak and Ihejurika had their first argument in my presence about something that had tactical relevance, which was a change from the previous 2 days when they'd been arguing about something I'd identified as a years-old disagreement about methodology in a completely unrelated field of study. They were standing in the primary research bay with 3 holographic pathogen models rotating above the central table, and Nowak was pointing at the cell signaling disruption diagram with the specific energy of someone who has been thinking about a problem for so long that the thinking has become physical. It's not targeting the cells, she said. It's targeting the signal. I know that, Ihejurika said. We've known that since day 1. No, I mean, it's not targeting the signal randomly. There's a pattern to which signals it disrupts first. She pulled up a comparative timeline. Look at the Vorn neurological data. Then, look at the Shektali cardiovascular data. Then, look at our cases. Ihejurika looked. There was a pause. Different entry points, he said. Different entry points, same end state. Nowak's finger moved across the hologram. It's adaptive. It finds the most efficient disruption pathway for each individual species' cellular communication architecture. Ihejurika was quiet for a moment. His expression shifted in a way I didn't have a reference for, something between calculation and something else I couldn't classify. So it's not a plague, he said. No, Nowak said. It's a key. It's different for every lock. I wrote this down. Then, I wrote, implication, pathogen may have been designed. Then, I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then, I wrote it again, in the second observation field, because I wanted it to be in 2 places. Adeyemi found me at hour 19 of their second operational day, sitting in the monitoring room with my logs open and a cold cup of something I'd been told was a calming compound but, which tasted like mineral runoff from a processing facility. She stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing herself. I noticed her in my peripheral sensory field. I can detect heat signatures at close range. It is one of the less tactically useful features of my biology that I have nonetheless found professionally helpful, and did not say anything, waiting to see whether she would speak or leave. She sat down. "You've been awake for 26 hours, she said. 28, I said. "I came on station rotation before your team arrived." She looked at my drink. "Is that helping?" "No." She nodded, like this was reasonable. She had a small container of her own, the same flat metal one I'd seen earlier, still apparently containing things. She opened it and pushed it toward me. I looked at it. "It won't kill you," she said. "Probably." A pause. "Definitely not. I checked your species toxicology profile this morning. Out of professional curiosity." "You checked my toxicology profile?" "I check everyone's. It's just what I do." She didn't seem to find this remarkable. "The thing in the middle is actually pretty close to something your metabolic system can process. The stuff on the left you should avoid." I did not eat the thing in the middle. But I noted that she knew which one it was. We sat for a moment in the sound of the station's ventilation system running at partial capacity, a slightly lower hum than normal, a minor tone change that most of the human team wouldn't notice, that I noticed every time I stopped focusing on something else. "Nowak's theory," I said. Adeyemi nodded. She'd heard. "If it's designed," I said, "then someone made it." "Yeah. Someone made it for this. For moving through multiple species." "Yeah." I looked at my log. I looked at the 47 lines of observation and the questions I hadn't answered and the one sentence I'd written twice. "Your team isn't afraid," I said. Not an accusation. An observation. "I'm an observer, it's what I do." Adeyemi turned her container in her hands, a slow rotation. "Some of us are," she said. "Ferreira doesn't sleep well when there's active pathogen in the station. Nowak gets a stress headache when she's close to something big." Adeyemi, she stopped, seemed to realize she'd used her own name, made a small sound that was either a laugh or a correction. "I'm, prone to lists. You may have noticed." I had noticed. She wrote lists on her arm sometimes. In actual ink, with a small pen she kept in the same pocket as Reeves kept her notebook. "But, afraid in the operational sense," she continued. "Of the pathogen itself?" A pause that wasn't quite empty. "We've been watching this thing move across the hegemony's contact reports for 8 months. 8 months of data. Something that goes through 63 species and doesn't touch us after a while, that stops feeling like luck and starts feeling like a problem we need to solve." I added this to my log. Then, I added, "They are afraid, but not of the thing that is killing everyone. They are afraid of why they're surviving it." Outside the monitoring room, the station hummed its partial capacity hum, and somewhere in Bay 14 the lights were still on, which meant Reeves was still working, and I sat with my cold drink that didn't help and my 47 observations and the slowly settling weight of understanding that I was watching something I didn't have a classification for yet. The humans were studying the plague. But the plague, I was beginning to think, should be studying them. By day 5, I had stopped pretending I was doing anything other than watching them. The performance of my official role, liaising, facilitating access, preparing status reports for Commander Veloshari, continued. I filed my reports. I answered Veloshari's queries. I attended the morning coordination briefings that the human team held in Bay 14 at what they called 0600 hours and what I called an aggressively early period of the station's artificial day cycle that reasonable entities do not voluntarily occupy. I did all of this. But the thing I was actually doing was watching. My observation logs had expanded past their original parameters. I had opened a second file, unofficial, personal, encrypted under a key only I held, because the first file had started to feel like it was being written for someone else, and some of the things I was observing didn't fit into the framework of what someone else would want to hear. For example, Ferreira had started naming the equipment. Not formally. Not in the official inventory system. In small ways that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been paying the kind of attention I was paying. She had a label maker, a small physical device that printed adhesive strips of text, and she was using it on equipment that already had designation codes. The atmospheric testing unit that the station logs called Unit ATM-7 now also had a small label on its left side that read Dolores. The primary centrifuge had acquired a label that said Eleanor. The portable containment scanner that Reeves carried everywhere had a label on the grip that said Fernando, which Reeves had apparently objected to but had not removed. I asked Ferreira about this. She thought about it in the way she thought about most things, which was for slightly longer than the question seemed to warrant, touching the label maker with one thumb while she considered. It's easier to keep track of things when they have names, she said. They have designation codes, I said. Sure. She looked at Dolores. But codes aren't. She searched for something. When something has a name, you notice it differently. If ATM-7 starts underperforming, I might not catch it until the data tells me. But if Dolores starts running rough, I notice it. Because I've been listening to her. This was one of those moments when I looked at what I was writing in my personal log and then looked at it again from a distance, trying to determine whether the notation I was making was a scientific observation or something else. I wrote, Ferreira has formed an attachment to the equipment. This appears to improve her operational awareness of equipment status. Then, I wrote, she talks to it sometimes. When she thinks no one is in the room. Then, I deleted the second note. Then, I wrote it back. The second thing I had stopped pretending about was the briefings themselves. The human team held them every morning, but held is not quite right. They were less structured than the word implies. Adeyemi would summarize overnight developments, and then they would all talk over each other for approximately 7 minutes while I stood near the door and wrote down everything, and then, somehow, without anyone formally calling order, without anyone being explicitly wrong, without any of the procedural frameworks that the hegemony used to reach decisions, they would have reached a decision. It looked chaotic from the outside. It functioned like something else from the inside. On the morning of day 5, Nowak put a new version of the pathogen model on the main display and said, I need to talk about the human immunity. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, the kind of pause that happens when a group of people who think quickly all process the same thing at once. Go ahead, Adeyemi said. The pathogen attacks the cellular signaling architecture of the host, Nowak said. She pulled up comparative data I had provided, cross-species cellular communication models, the hegemony's biological library on 31 of the affected species. But it can't do that if the architecture is already disrupted. If the baseline signal pattern is, for lack of a better term, noisy enough, the pathogen can't find a clean entry point. She zoomed in on the human cellular model. Human cellular communication is already running about 43% noisier than the galactic average for sapient species. Partially evolutionary, you're coming off a pretty high-stress developmental history. Partially metabolic. You're running hotter than most comparable species, your cellular activity rate is elevated, and your immune systems are. She stopped, appearing to search for a word. Aggressive, Ihejirika offered. Aggressive, she agreed, with the tone of someone accepting a word that is accurate but undersells the thing it is describing. Your immune system doesn't distinguish well between foreign thing that is a threat and foreign thing that is not a threat. It flags everything. It fights everything. For most environments, that's metabolically expensive and sometimes counterproductive. But, for this pathogen specifically, it can't get a word in edgewise, Reeves said. Nowak pointed at her. That's one way to say it. I had been standing near the door. I was now standing near the table. I had moved at some point during this explanation without deciding to. The pathogen was designed, I said. You said this 2 days ago. That's still the working hypothesis, yes. Designed for species with stable, low-noise cellular signaling. Which is most of the galactic community. I moved my hands, a gesture from my own species communication vocabulary that means bring the conclusion forward. But, not for humans. Not for humans, Nowak said. She was looking at me with the specific attention that I had come to recognize meant she was about to say something she had been working toward for a while. Which means either the designer didn't know humans existed to possible, tearing contact with the wider galactic community is relatively recent, or the designer didn't consider humans a significant enough population to account for. Eureka pushed away from the table slightly. Or both. Or both. Adeyemi had been writing on her arm. She looked up. Or the designer thought this was a contained deployment and didn't expect it to reach human populations. Everyone looked at her. Someone let this out, she said. Somewhere specific. Somewhere they thought they could control the spread. And, then, they didn't control it. I looked at my log. I had 53 lines and a second file with 14 lines I hadn't shared with anyone. You've been briefed on the origin transmission data, I said. This was not, technically, a question. It was a way of determining what they knew without asking what they knew, which is a habit I have developed over 12 cycles of working in environments where the distinction between what is officially shared and what is practically needed is a kind of organizational fiction everyone maintains out of professional courtesy. Adeyemi met my eyes. She had a way of doing this, of accepting the weight of what was underneath a question that I had catalogued as a specifically human quality, though I hadn't yet determined whether it was cultural or individual. She wrote it on her arm. The first case reports cluster around a single transit corridor, she said. Sector 9. The old relay stations. Nowak mapped it out the first night. It began somewhere along the Velsheth passage, I said. The words came out differently than I expected, quieter, I think, though I am not always accurate in my self-assessments. Adeyemi looked at me. That's hegemony space, she said. Not an accusation. She said it the way she said most things, like a point on a map, a coordinate, the beginning of a route rather than an endpoint. Yes, I said. The ventilation ran its partial capacity hum. Ferreira was touching the edge of the table with 2 fingers, a slow rhythm, the same rhythm she used when she was processing information. I had noticed that the rhythm always resolved, it didn't loop, it concluded. She stopped when she'd finished thinking, not before. She stopped. Is that why you're here? She said. Not unkindly. Not aggressively. With the directness of someone who has decided that indirect phrasing is a waste of available time. Not to facilitate. To watch us. I looked at my log, which was open, which had always been open. Yes, I said. The conversation that followed was not what I expected. I had prepared, somewhat, for several responses. Suspicion was the most likely. Hegemony monitoring of non-aligned biological response teams was not unknown, and the human cooperative had been briefed on hegemony information policies. Hostility was possible. A formal communication to their command structure requesting my reassignment was within established diplomatic norms. What happened was that Adeyemi said okay and asked if I was willing to share my observation data, because it might be useful. I looked at her. It might fill in gaps, she said. You've been tracking things. You notice things. She said this plainly, without the particular cadence of flattery. The stuff you put in your official reports is useful. The stuff you probably have in your personal logs is the stuff we need. My personal logs were encrypted. She hadn't seen them. She was inferring them. Because she had been watching me watch them, and she had concluded that a person who writes down everything would have a secondary file for the things they didn't want anyone else to read. Ferreira's rhythm had stopped again, but she hadn't started it again, which was different. I opened my secondary log. I turned it toward Adeyemi. The observations from day 1 to day 3 are my initial assessments, I said. Some of them may be inaccurate. I was working from a framework that may not apply. Adeyemi picked it up. She read slowly. She didn't react to most of it, which I expected, because most of it was technical. Then, she reached the entry from day 2 that I had written twice. She looked at it. She read it twice, the same way I had written it twice. Someone designed this, she said. Not to me, specifically. To the room. To the space where everyone was quietly turning over the same thought. That's not confirmed, Nowak said. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone confirming that a thing is not confirmed because they need it to not be confirmed while they're still working. No, Adeyemi agreed. She put the log down. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, another human behavior I had catalogued and, not quite classified, this upward directed attention during cognitive processing, as though the answers might be written somewhere above the level of what is directly in front of you. She looked back down. But, we're going to act like it is, she said. Because if it is and we act like it isn't, that's the kind of mistake that only happens once. I wrote, Adeyemi calculates risk in a specific way. She accounts for worst-case scenarios not by preparing against them, but by assuming them and working forward. Then, I wrote, I have been trained to do the opposite. I have been trained to work from confirmed data and advance only to the next confirmed position. Then, I wrote, I am starting to think her method is better for this particular situation. Then, I deleted that last line. Then, I wrote it back. Reeves found the anomaly on day 6 at approximately 0300. I know the time precisely because she woke me through my calm implant, which is something I had not given her authorization to do and which she had apparently figured out how to do anyway, through means she later described as Ferreira helped and which Ferreira later described as she asked very nicely. Velasthery. Hey. You sleeping? The word she used was sleeping, not resting, which is what my species does in our equivalent restorative period. I had noted this vocabulary distinction earlier but had not expected it to present at 0300. I said. Good. Sorry. We've got something. She was in Bay 14. She had been in Bay 14 since approximately 2000 hours, running longitudinal cell culture samples against the pathogen in controlled microdose exposures. These were experiments that our own researchers had begun before the human team arrived, but the results had been inconsistent partial exposure data, contaminated controls, the methodological gaps that happen when a research team is also losing members to the thing it's studying. Reeves had been rebuilding the experiment from the beginning. On the central display above the culture station, she had a new model running. Three-dimensional, color-coded by cell activity state. The infected cells, from the Voin samples, low-level exposure, were cycling through the disruption pattern I'd seen in every model for the last 11 days. The cellular signaling going dark in the predictable sequence, the progressive isolation, the system forgetting how to be a system. But, in one section of the model, something was different. I added a human cellular extract, Reeves said. Just trace amounts. Way below anything that would affect the culture conditions. She pointed. Look. The disruption pattern had slowed in the section adjacent to the human extract. Not stopped, but slowed. Measurably. The cells in that zone were taking nearly twice as long to show the signaling degradation. The cellular noise, I said. The cellular noise, she confirmed. It's not just that the pathogen can't infect human cells. Some component of the human cellular environment, I don't know which one yet, I have about 14 hypotheses, actively interferes with the pathogen's targeting mechanism when it's in proximity. I stood at the display for a moment, looking at the two sections of the model. The section where the disruption moved at its normal pace, clean and inevitable. The section where it moved slower, or something in the adjacent human material was making the certainty uncertain. If you can isolate the component, I said. Yeah, Reeves said. A therapeutic application, yeah. She was already back at the culture station, already working. She had a tablet open next to her with 14 lines of notation and her small physical notebook open beside that. The notebook had more writing in it than I'd seen before. She wrote in the notebook differently than she wrote on the tablet. The notebook writing was faster, more compressed, with arrows between some entries that connected things I couldn't follow yet. I pulled up a stool. I had not been invited to stay. I had also not been asked to leave. I have found, in my 12 cycles of fieldwork, that these are often the same thing, and the protocol for both is to sit quietly and observe until the situation changes. Reeves worked. I watched. The station hummed at partial capacity, and the model on the display showed cells that were dying slower than they should, and somewhere in the annotation on Reeves' tablet there was probably the beginning of something that might matter. Might. That word does a lot of work in crisis situations. It is either the most hopeful word in any language or the cruelest, depending on what comes after it. She was on her 9th notation when she said, without looking up, "You said the plague started in hegemony space." "That's the current assessment," I said. "Does your command know who made it?" A pause. "The ventilation. The model cycling." "I don't know what my command knows," I said. This was true, and, also, in the way of many true things, a response designed to be accurate without being complete. Reeves looked up. She didn't push. She had a way of asking questions and, then, allowing the space after them to do the additional work, which was different from how most interrogative conversations worked in my experience. I looked at my log. I looked at the notation I had written twice and, then, read Adeyemi reading twice. "There are sealed files in the Hegemony's incident database," I said. "Relating to a research project. One that was discontinued approximately 14 months ago." A pause. "I filed a formal access request before I was deployed here. The request was denied." Reeves went back to her notation. "So someone in your government built it," she said. Statement, not question. Quiet, the way she said things that she'd already decided. I said nothing. She wrote something in her notebook. Drew an arrow to something she'd written earlier. "Okay," she said. "Then, we need to work faster." She had the specific quality, in that moment, of someone who has received information they didn't want and has processed it and filed it and moved forward, not because the information doesn't matter, but because it can't matter yet, because there is work to do first and the mattering can happen after. I don't have a word in my language for that. I wrote it in my log anyway. Describe the thing around the edges of it, the way you would describe a shape by the space it leaves. At 0300 on day 6, Reeves found the beginning of something that might matter. I sat beside her for the next 4 hours, writing down everything I saw. This is what I do when I don't know what else to do. It turns out, watching humans work, I kept doing it even when I did. On day 9, Commander Veloshari contacted me directly. Not through the standard reporting channel. Through my personal calm line, which was a distinction that carried its own message. I had been on Ossiver Station for 17 days. I had filed 14 official reports. I had not filed my secondary observation log, the encrypted one, the one with the notation I'd written twice. Veloshari's voice came in at 1100 hours, station time, while I was watching Ehegerika and Nowak run the 7th iteration of Reeves' proximity interference experiment. The 7th iteration had introduced 2 isolated variables that the 6th hadn't accounted for. The 6th had been better than the 5th. The pattern was continuing. "Observer Velastari," Veloshari said. "I'd like a verbal briefing." I stepped into the corridor. The corridor smelled differently now than it had when the human team arrived. Still antiseptic, still the particular mineral trace that I'd started associating with this whole period of my life. But, underlaid with something the human team had introduced, the smell of things being cooked in the small habitation module they'd been assigned, the faint machine oil residue of equipment being constantly handled, the almost unclassifiable ambient warmth that human biological activity generates in a closed environment. The station felt less like a dying thing than it had 9 days ago. I was not sure whether to log this as a technical observation or a personal one. The human team has made significant progress on the pathogen isolation problem, I told Veloshari. Their current model suggests a viable therapeutic mechanism. Approximately, I stopped, consulting my notes. Approximately 11 days from a deployable compound. If current progress holds. The Hegemony's medical division has its own parallel workstream, Veloshari said. I'm aware. The results of the human team's research will need to be properly channeled through official protocols before any deployment. I looked at the corridor wall. There was a small scuff on the surface near the quarantine seal that Reeves had repaired 6 days ago. The seal she'd repaired in 3 minutes and 40 seconds while not wearing the required protective equipment. The seal that would have failed within 16 minutes if she hadn't. Of course, I said. There's also the matter of the origin assessment, Veloshari said. I waited. The human team has been pursuing a hypothesis regarding deliberate pathogen design, Veloshari continued. The phrasing was very careful. Official language in my bureaucratic tradition is like this: the more careful the phrasing, the more significant the thing being carefully phrased around. They have, I said. That hypothesis is speculative at this stage. They consider it a working assumption, I said. They are treating it as speculative while acting on it as though confirmed. Which I have come to understand is a specific cognitive approach for situations where the cost of being wrong is observer velasthery. I stopped. The sealed files you requested access to, Veloshari said. That request has been escalated. You'll receive a response within 48 hours. I processed this. An access request that had been denied was now being escalated. In the normal functioning of hegemony bureaucracy, escalation meant one of two things: either someone with authority had decided to accelerate the information flow, or someone with authority had decided that the existence of the request needed to be officially acknowledged before anything else happened. Thank you, I said. Continue your monitoring function, Veloshari said. Maintain comprehensive records. The comm closed. I stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the station's partial capacity hum, looking at the scuff near the quarantine seal. Then, I went back into the research bay and wrote down everything that had just happened, including what had not been said. Adeyemi came to find me that afternoon. I had started to notice that she found me when there was something she had decided to address and had been deciding for some time, and the finding was the completion of the decision rather than the beginning of it. She sat across from me in the monitoring room. She had her arm turned up, there was writing on it, several lines, her small cramped notation system that I was beginning to be able to partially read. The compound, she said. If it works. It will work, I said. She looked at me. How confident are you? More confident than I've been about anything on this station for the last week and a half. I paused. Which is its own data point. She almost smiled. It came and went. The compound will need to be manufactured at scale, she said. The synthesis process isn't complicated once the component is isolated, but the precursor materials require specific acquisition pathways. Hegemony medical facilities could do it. Terran cooperative facilities could do it. Either way, someone needs to authorize the production. I'm aware. I'm telling you because I want to know whether the authorization will happen. She was asking me whether the hegemony would move on this. Whether the bureaucratic structures that managed official protocol would move fast enough. She was asking me this because she had been watching me for 9 days and had concluded, correctly, that I knew things about how the hegemony functions that weren't in any accessible file, the same way I had concluded things about her team that weren't in their official BIOS. I don't know, I said. I know what the correct answer is. I know what will happen if the authorization is delayed. I don't know if those two pieces of knowledge are sufficient to determine the outcome. She was quiet for a moment. How many species are in active outbreak right now, she said. I consulted my station data. Confirmed active outbreaks in 14 species populations. Suspected, but unconfirmed, in another 9. Ossiver's case count is currently stable, we're not adding new cases on this station. But 3 other relay stations along the Velsheth corridor have filed emergency medical requests in the last 72 hours. Adeyemi looked at the table. She made a small sound, not quite a word, the kind of sound that means I am processing this information and the weight of it is physical. 11 days, she said. Maybe 9 if Nowak finds the shortcut she's been looking for. She's close? She's always close. She gets close and, then, she makes it closer by force of irritation. She said this with the specific warmth that I had observed was reserved for the people she actually trusted. She spent 3 hours last night being furious at a model that wasn't cooperating. Ihejurika timed it. He does that, he times things, it helps him think. She paused. Nowak was at her best at hour 2.5. The model gave her what she needed around hour 3. I wrote this down. I don't know why. Some of my log entries from this period are not what you would call strictly relevant. They are notations about the way people work, the way they think, the specific sounds they make when things go wrong and things go right. I kept filing them under observation data and kept not quite believing that was the correct category. Velasthery, Adeyemi said. She said my name the way she'd been saying it since the first day, fully, without abbreviating it, which is what most non-hegemony contacts do because the consonant clustering is unusual for them. She'd looked it up, she told me once. She looked up how to say it correctly. Out of professional courtesy, she said. Or respect, she added, and seemed briefly uncertain about which word she'd meant. Yes, I said. If the authorization gets stuck, if there's a delay, or a procedural thing, or someone decides that the origin investigation needs to run before the therapeutic program gets approved, that won't happen, I said. I said it before I decided to say it. Adeyemi looked at me. If it looks like it's going to happen, I said, more carefully, I have 47 official observation logs and a secondary file that I have not submitted. The secondary file contains a notation that I have written twice. If those files were submitted simultaneously through the proper reporting channels and also forwarded to the Hegemony's Independent Oversight Committee and also shared with the Terran Cooperative and also distributed to the contacts in the 6 other affected species medical bodies that I have accumulated over 12 cycles in the Monitoring Corps, I paused. That would create a significant amount of administrative motion. Adeyemi was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her before. I looked at the table. I have been very thorough in my monitoring, I said. It's what I do. There was a pause. Yeah, she said. I've noticed. The shortcut Nowak had been looking for arrived on day 11 at 0140 hours. I was in the research bay. I had been in the research bay continuously for approximately 19 hours, which I want to note was not unusual by that point in the deployment. The human team kept irregular hours that I had initially tried to pattern track and eventually stopped, because the pattern was they work until the thing is done and then they sleep for approximately 6 hours and then they do it again, and I had found that schedule was easier to match than to observe from outside. Nowak made the sound. I had heard her working for 11 days. I knew most of her sounds. There was the sound she made when a model confirmed something she expected, which was a sort of flat affirmative exhale. There was the sound she made when a model failed, which was more complicated, a multi-layered expression that I had catalogued under frustration with productive subtext because it never sounded like giving up, just like taking the problem apart. There was the sound she made when she was arguing with a Hedgerika, which was distinctive and not difficult to identify. This was not any of those sounds. It was shorter. Very short. One syllable, involuntary, the kind of sound that happens when the body reacts before the mind has finished processing. She made it and then there was 3 seconds of silence and then she said, Hedgerika. Hedgerika was across the room. He was at her side in a way that made me think he had been anticipating this for some time. They stood together at the display. They were quiet for longer than was normal. That's it, Hedgerika said. That's it, Nowak confirmed. Reeves looked up from her culture station. She had been running overnight samples with the methodical quality she brought to everything: present, focused, patient. She looked at the display. She looked at Nowak. Isolated, she said. Isolated, Nowak said. The compound it's one of the simpler ones, structurally. That's why it took this long to find it, honestly. I kept looking for something complex. A pause that had the quality of someone recalibrating their understanding of their own assumptions. It's the noise floor itself. The basic metabolic interference signal. Humans generate it all the time just by being alive. Ferreira had appeared from somewhere. I didn't see her arrive. She had a way of appearing rather than entering spaces. She was looking at the display with her hands very still, which was unusual, and which I had come to understand meant something significant was happening, and she was making room for the significance to land before she responded to it. can it be synthesized, she said. It's essentially a metabolic byproduct, Nowak said. We'd need to, there are some complexities in the synthesis pathway. She was already pulling up secondary models, already checking the synthesis viability. The discovery had not stopped her. The discovery was the beginning of the next problem, and she was already at the next problem, turning it over, looking for the edges of it. Adeyemi was at the doorway. I don't know when she'd arrived. She looked at the display and then at her team and then at me. I was writing in my log. Of course I was writing in my log. The synthesis pathway was, as Nowak had warned, complicated. Not prohibitively complicated. Complicated in the way that complex things are complicated when you have the right people and the right equipment and the specific kind of stubbornness that the human team brought to everything they did. Complicated in the way where the complication was a series of problems, and problems were things that had solutions, and solutions were things that could be found if you didn't stop looking. They didn't stop looking. By 0600 on day 11, they had a viable synthesis protocol. By 1000 hours, they had a first-generation compound formulation. By 1400 hours, the formulation had been run against live pathogen cultures in controlled exposure conditions. I watched the model on the display. The disruption pattern, the one I had been watching since before the human team arrived, the one that had become the central image of my nightmares during the periods when I was sleeping, the clean and inevitable sequence of cells forgetting how to communicate, of systems becoming isolated, of a whole thing becoming a collection of not quite wholes, ran against the treated cell cultures. And faltered. Not immediately. Not perfectly. It found some cells, disrupted some signaling. But it was slower, and the slowness wasn't uniform, it was uneven, the pathogen searching for clean entry points and finding interference, trying another route and finding more interference, burning its way through the noise. The cultures didn't fail. Partial exposures, controlled conditions, not a final clinical answer. I noted this with precision in my log. I noted every qualification, every limitation, every reason that this result needed to be validated, replicated, tested in non-controlled conditions, scaled, reviewed. And then, I noted, the pathogen lost. Below that I wrote the time and the cell culture identification codes and the exposure parameters. Below that I wrote it again. I filed the synthesis protocol to Commander Veloshari at 1437 hours on day 11. I filed it through the official reporting channel. I also forwarded it to the Hegemony's Independent Oversight Committee. I also shared it with the contacts I had mentioned to Adeyemi. 12 years of field monitoring work, 12 years of being the person who writes everything down, generates a certain number of people who read what you write. I did not wait to see whether the official channel would move before the other channels started moving. Adeyemi was standing near me when I sent the forward. She didn't comment on it. She had been watching me do it, standing close enough to see the recipient list, and she didn't say anything. Then, she went back to her team and they kept working, because the synthesis protocol was day 11 and full-scale manufacturing capacity was a logistics problem and logistics problems had their own sequence of sub-problems, and the human team treated these the way they treated everything, as the next thing, the current thing, the thing in front of them right now. I called Veloshari. The synthesis protocol has been transmitted, I said. A pause. I saw, Veloshari said. I also forwarded it to, I saw that too, Veloshari said. The voice had the specific flatness of someone deciding how to respond to something they cannot undo and would not have authorized in advance. A long pause. The Oversight Committee has already acknowledged receipt. Yes, I said. Another pause. The authorization for production scale-up will be processed through priority channels, Veloshari said. I will ensure it. I said nothing. Observer Velastari, Veloshari said. The sealed files you requested. They'll be in your inbox within the hour. I thought about this for a moment. I'll review them, I said. Yes, said Veloshari. I assumed you would. The call ended. I sat with my logs, both of them, the official one and the encrypted one, and the partial capacity hum of the station, and the distant sound of the research bay where Ferreira was updating the name labels on the equipment for the synthesis stage, naming the new centrifuge something, naming the thermal unit something, talking to them in the low private voice she used when she thought the room was empty. I noted this. I noted it was not relevant in any technical sense. I noted it anyway. The sealed files arrived as Veloshari had promised. I read them in the monitoring room, alone, door closed. 14 months ago, a research division within the Hegemony's Biological Sciences Authority had begun a program designated Pale Reduction Protocol. The stated goal was the development of a population management tool for the Aerith migration corridors. The Aerith were a non-sapient organism that periodically devastated agricultural systems across several colony worlds, a genuine problem that had resisted conventional interventions for decades. The pathogen had been designed to interrupt the cellular signaling of the Aerith breeding cycle. The Aerith had cellular architecture that was, in the Hegemony's biological library, the simplest possible structure. Low metabolic noise. Clean signaling. The ideal target for a precision disruption pathogen. Someone had failed to account for the 31 sapient species that shared a similar cellular architecture. Or had not considered that the pathogen might reach them. Or both. The file did not answer which. The file did not identify who had made the decision to proceed with the deployment test, which had taken place in an uninhabited sector of the Velsheth corridor, in a controlled ecological zone that was supposed to contain the spread. The containment had failed. The file noted this with the same careful official phrasing that Veloshari had used on the comm call. I read the file 3 times. Then, I added a notation to my secondary log: the plague was not malice. It was error. These are different things. I have not determined yet whether the difference matters, given the outcome, but they are different. Then, I added, the Hegemony knew the origin for at least 9 days before the human team arrived. They sent me to monitor the humans. I don't know if they expected the humans to find a solution or to fail. I don't know if I was supposed to be here as a recorder or as a reminder that this was Hegemony space and Hegemony problems and Hegemony solutions. Then, I added, I don't think they accounted for what the humans would actually do. I added, I don't think they accounted for me either. The human team left Ossiver Station on day 19. The manufacturing authorization had been processed through priority channels, as Veloshari had promised. 3 Hegemony medical production facilities and 1 Terran cooperative facility were already running the synthesis protocol. The first therapeutic batches were in transit to the worst affected populations. NOAC had done a follow-up on the Vorn case data and estimated that with prompt treatment, systemic failure could be arrested at stage 2 in approximately 84% of current cases. 84% was not a perfect number. I noted this. I noted all the things it was not. Then, I noted what it was. Reeves finished her last overnight shift in Bay 14 and came to find me in the monitoring room. She looked tired in the specific way she had looked tired since day 3, not degraded, exactly, more like a device running at a higher operational load than its standard configuration, which was somehow managing, but which you could tell was managing by looking at it carefully. She had a cup of something she'd made in the habitation module. The smell of it was complex, slightly acidic, deeply wrong, and she sat across from me and drank it in the particular way of someone who has decided that this is the comfort they have available and they are going to have it fully. You got the sealed files, she said. I looked at her. Adeyemi noticed your face change yesterday, she said. After the call with your commander. She said it looked like you'd received confirmation of something you'd been hoping wasn't true. She noticed that, I said. She notices things. Reeves turned her cup. She doesn't always say what she notices. But, she notices. I thought about the transit corridor. The controlled ecological zone. The error that wasn't contained. Your team will need to be briefed, I said. Officially. There will need to be a formal accounting. A Hegemony member species weaponized. I stopped. Started again. Created something that functioned as a weapon, whether or not it was intended that way. That needs to go through proper channels. Diplomatic channels. The affected species communities will need formal, yeah, Reeves said. That'll happen. She said it with the specific tone of someone who does not doubt that a thing will happen, but is also not under any illusion that the happening will be clean or simple or without cost. It won't be fast. And the right people won't all get the accountability they should, probably. And there'll be debates about intent versus outcome for, she thought, a while. Probably a long while. I looked at my logs. The official file. The secondary file. The sealed files I had opened and read 3 times and would read again and would eventually have to decide what to do with. Does that bother you? I said. Reeves considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions she actually intended to answer. Yeah, she said. But I can't do anything about the political outcome from here. I can do the next part, whatever it is. She paused. Something will need to be done about the other outbreaks that are developing. That's probably where we end up next. She didn't say this like a soldier awaiting orders. More like someone consulting a list. The way Adeyemi wrote on her arm. The way Ferreira named the equipment. The way Ehejurika timed things. A method of imposing manageable sequence on a situation that didn't come with sequence pre-installed. Reeves, I said. I had a question I had been carrying since approximately day 3. I had been deciding whether to ask it for 16 days and had kept not asking because I was not certain the answer would be one I could properly receive. Why? I said. She looked at me. The exposed corridor. The seal. The hours. The nights. I looked at my log. All of it. You can't stop the plague from every station it's already in. You can't personally repair every failed quarantine seal. You can't. I stopped. Reeves tilted her cup slightly, watching the liquid in it. No, she said. Then, why? She put the cup down. She looked at the monitoring room wall for a moment, the same way Adeyemi looked at ceilings, as though answers were slightly elevated above the level of what was immediately in front of you. The person in Bay 14, she said. In Stage 2. The Shektali, the one who filed the second case report. She looked back at me. Her name is in your station files. Did you read her name? I had read her name. There's a Vorn in the medical tier, Reeves continued. First case on Ossiver. His cellular signaling is still degrading, but the rate slowed after we introduced the compound to his treatment protocol. Slowed enough that we think he'll stabilize. A pause. That's one person. On one station. And there are how many stations? Currently active outbreak locations, how many people, she said. Not cutting me off. Specifying. I consulted the data. I told her the number. She nodded, like she already knew it, which she probably did. That's how many, she said. That's why. I looked at my log. I looked at the number I had just said. I looked at her, drinking her terrible cup of something in the monitoring room of a station that had been dying when she arrived and wasn't, entirely, anymore. I didn't write anything. For approximately 2 minutes I sat in the monitoring room and did not write anything, which is the longest I have gone without writing something in a professional context in 12 cycles of fieldwork. Then, I wrote, she knows all the names. Then, I wrote, she can't fix all the stations. She knows this. She's doing this station anyway. Below that, I left a blank line. I haven't filled it in yet. The human team departed at 0900 on day 19. Adeyemi filed a formal after-action summary with the Hegemony Monitoring Corps, thorough, methodical, the way she did everything, with a section at the end that was titled Recommendations for Future Interspecies Response Coordination and, which contains 17 items, the last of which was, Hegemony monitoring observers assigned to human response teams should be formally integrated into the team structure rather than positioned as external surveyors. The current arrangement creates information asymmetry that reduces overall operational efficiency. Recommend observer-grade personnel be given full access and formal collaborative standing. She had written it that way. Recommend. As though it were a procedural suggestion. She had copied it to the Independent Oversight Committee. She had also, I later discovered, personally transmitted a copy to my file in the monitoring core records, which she did not have authorization to do and which she had apparently done through means she described, when I asked, as Ferreira helped. I was standing in Base 7 when they departed. I had my log open. I had been debating whether to say something. I have 12 cycles of experience with departures and the protocol for them is not complicated, it does not require comment, it is simply the completion of an assignment and the formal conclusion of a monitoring engagement. Adeyemi shook my hand. This is a human contact greeting that I had read about and had not, until this moment, experienced, and it is stranger than the description suggests, a kind of brief physical communication that says something I don't have a word for in my language. She held it slightly longer than the sources I'd read said was standard. Good luck with the files, she said. She meant the sealed ones. She knew I still had to decide what to do with them. Good luck with the next station, I said. She almost smiled again. This time it stayed. Reeves was last. She stopped beside me with her kit bag and her notebook in her pocket and the label on her scanner grip that said Fernando that she had never removed. Hey, she said. Write it all down. I always do, I said. No, she said, I mean write it so people can read it. Not just file it. She looked at me with the same occupied elsewhere quality she'd had the first day, except I had been watching her for 19 days now and I knew the elsewhere was not absence. It was attention distributed across more things than most beings tracked at once. She shouldered her bag and went through the docking lock. I stood in Base 7 for a while after. Then, I went back to the monitoring room. I opened a new file. This one is not encrypted. This one is for people to read. This is what I wrote. I have filled 47 official logs and 1 secondary file and now this. I do not know what the hegemony will do with the origin documentation. I do not know whether the accountability process will reach the people who made the decisions it should reach. I do not know whether the next outbreak will be contained as quickly as this one, or more quickly, or whether there are more pathogen variants somewhere that we have not found yet. I know the synthesis compound is in production. I know the case count on Ossiver Station is not rising. I know that the Vorn patient in the medical tier, the first case, the one whose name is in the station files, sent a message to the research bay this morning. I read it because I was watching the communications log, as I watch everything. It was in Vorn, which my translation buffer handles imperfectly, and the sense of it was approximately, "Thank you for working on this while I was sick." I would like to know the names of the people I should thank. Reeves is not on the station anymore to receive it. I forwarded the message to her. I added her COM address to my contacts list, which is something I do not do with observation subjects. She replied at 0312 this morning. I don't know which transit her team is on. I don't know where they're going. The message said, "Thanks for the forward. Tell him we're glad he's better." And tell him, and then, a sentence I have been trying to translate correctly for 6 hours now, a sentence in English that has a structure my language does not quite have a matching structure for. Something about how the work isn't done, which is not a defeat and is not a complaint. Something about how that is all right. I don't have a word for that in my language. I am beginning to think I am going to need one.